it's a huge pleasure to welcome you this evening to celebrate the publication next week. We're just a bit ahead of time of a fantastic book by Carlton Turner called Caribbean Contextual Theology, and it's published by SCM Press. And I think if you've ordered it, pre-ordered it, it will probably be dropping onto your doormats on the 31st of January. But if you haven't already ordered it, please order it now. I will wait for Carlton to wave it at you or one of the other contributors, because mine has not yet. But you'll have to wait till you're on screen, Carlton. Mine has not yet dropped through my letterbox, but I'm really, really looking forward to reading it, because I know that this is an area of huge importance, and Caribbean contextual theology is not new. And I know that part of what Carlton is doing is to fill in and give an overview in what is, I think, a kind of textbook, a digest, as well as it having lots of Carlton himself in it from the kind of 70s till now. And I think it's going to fill a gap in our theological bibliographies. And I'm so delighted that Carlton has given us the time to be with us this evening. It's a real honour, Carlton, to have you, and also a massive honour that you're joined by two other Caribbean contextual theologians. I will say a little bit about each of you now, but obviously it's for you to define yourselves in the way that you find most appropriate. But Carlton, I know that you teach at Queen's, the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, and you're also an Anglican priest in Birmingham. And Eevee, also an Anglican priest. We've got 3 Reverend Doctors here this evening, which is interesting. Eevee, one thing I can wave is the Modern Church journal, Modern Believing. Do urge you, if you're not already a member of Modern Church, to join Modern Church, and that will get you this journal and a quarterly edition of it. Eevee has an article in this current edition called Grandy Nanny Dream Me, which is her input to the Modern Church Conference last July, which absolutely fantastic, a poetic storytelling engagement with Caribbean theology, and also an engagement with issues of racism. So that's a little bit about Eevee, who's also worked for USPG as a theological advisor and been a director of mission studies at Selly Oak Colleges in Birmingham. So great to have you with us, Eevee. The other Reverend Dr Stephen Jennings, a Baptist minister, Baptist pastor in Kingston, Jamaica, and is joining us from Jamaica this evening, I'm assuming, and is a teacher at the United Theological College of the West Indies, where Eevee has also taught. So we have lots of overlaps between our speakers, which is fantastic. We're going to start with Carlton giving us an overview of the book, why he wrote it, what's in it, how he sees it as being important in our current theological context, and also, I hope, some of Carlton's passions behind the obvious huge amount of work that he's put into this book. Then Eevee and Stephen will come in for a certain amount of time, 10 minutes each-ish, to give their thoughts about the book. We are launching it this evening, so we want to give it a good focus, but also to then have some conversation, particularly between our panelists about the content, and maybe identify some challenges in it, some developments that we think ought to happen as a result of it, and maybe political, theological challenges to academy and church that might well emerge from it. So, Carlton, over to you first. Tell us about Caribbean Contextual Theology, SCM Press 2024.
2024. Okay, thank you, Alison. Good evening. Good evening to everyone listening in, and good evening to my companions on this panel. Before I answer this question, allow me to give thanks to Modern Church for putting on this event. I said that this will be a Caribbean year, and I was serious. I think it's the region that I certainly know best and love most, and is worth celebrating. I'm grateful to Eevee and to Stephen for walking with me. Let me begin with Eevee quickly. Eevee um, was my PhD supervisor, and I must give thanks to her because she was the exact person I needed for my journey to get the work done. And Stephen, you cannot escape the name Stephen Jennings when you do theology or look up theology in the Caribbean context. He's written immensely. In fact, my work couldn't have been done without some of the foundations he set. So thank you. It's a blessing to have you both here. I'm also grateful for the many scholars over the decades, too many to mention, and I hope they're recorded in the book, who have made huge contributions to global theological conversations from the Caribbean context. And I'm also grateful for my journey. Some 20 years ago, I sat in a systematic theology class at Carlton College, Barbados. And it was the one class that was given by Dr. Monroe Williams that gave us an overview of the developments in Caribbean theology. And he opened up our minds to the fact that so much was available that needed to be built upon. But sadly, that was only one session out of a 3-year BA degree. And that's all that was allowed. And that just sparked something in me. I'm a linguist at heart and a Spanish teacher, and did a whole lot of linguistics, particularly sociolinguistics. So the idea that my theology is not influenced by my culture and my context genuinely, I might say something bad, but it got me upset. And that has been a journey through doing a PhD on African traditional religious heritages and cultures, and particularly Jonknu in the Bahamas, to what we have today. And a lot of things have come together. Being a practical and contextual theologian at the Queen's Foundation gives me a particular lens, a gaze in which to do this kind of reflection. So I'm grateful to Queen's because I've been journeying with Queen since 2008, and it's a place where I get to really grow as a practical and contextual theologian. SCM and David Shervington has on their agenda the need to increase global and cutting edge theological perspectives. So SCM approached me about doing this kind of thing. At the same time, Rev Dr Michael Clark at Carlton College asked me to revise and teach their Caribbean theology course. So somehow all of this came together. So now that I've said that, let me talk about the book. What is it that I'm passionate about regarding Caribbean contextual theology? And for those who may not know what I mean when I say that, I mean theology which is never neutral, that arises from the context, the ways of life, the situations of a particular place and time and people. There is no theology that is acontextual. And when we consider every particular context, we learn so much that we didn't know before. We don't see God the same way. We don't read the Bible the same way. We don't conceive of life in the same way. But we learn that when we dig into the context of a place, a time, a people. So in the book, I try to present firstly the complexity of the region. This is a theological challenge. One major starting point of the book is that the Caribbean itself is extremely complex and defies easy descriptions. Secondly, I addressed the key theological issues from a Caribbean perspective. There is a wealth of theological works that have paved the way, and I think it's only fitting that the first 3 chapters in the book devotes itself to bringing to the forefront and reminding people that there have been decades of works that have come forward that need and require some engagement with. And I put energy into doing that, and I pray that I do that, with grace and honor and dignity, because it has helped me massively. There is a powerful legacy there. Next, I want to challenge some entrenched theological ideas based on the history of the region, which is a history of trauma. God has never been a neutral or static term. There is no one standard way of doing theology, and the region is quite unique as the gateway to the New World. In 1492, we see the complicated interaction between Western and non-Western theologies and epistemologies in the person of Columbus and his encounter with the peoples of the Americas, which led to genocide and enslavement. But that is not the entire story of the region. After the gold had been taken away, after the slaves had been imported, after the East India Company brought indentured laborers, and despite continued political, economic, environmental, and health assault on the region, there is still something that survived. And there is still an impulse to create something new, in spite of the continued demands of colonial and neo-colonial powerhouses and their theologies. And the big question, I think, is, and something I continuously monitor, is where do we find this ingenuity from? And I don't think this is a simple idealistic question. It is a testament to a region and a story that is far greater than enslavement and plantation houses. We survive and continue to survive when we should never have been. And we are a reflection of the great issues, abundant issues within our world. And I pay attention to the deep spirituality of the people of the region that continually contests, let me say this very carefully, Euro-American ideas about how Christianity should be conceived and practiced. Ultimately, I'm trying to open up a conversation and suggesting that there are new ways of thinking about contemporary issues facing both church and society. It is this final thing, this opening up, that excites me most. So when you read the book, there are 3 chapters that set a foundation, and then there are 5 others where I do a kind of Caribbean theological reflection on different issues. One of them is a chapter about Columbus and missionary Christianity and its aftermath. I wrestle with what mission might truly mean and how models of church must be constructed in light of some deeply problematic tendencies in the Christianity that coming out of the West. I speak about African traditional religions. I pay attention to African traditional religious heritages in the region and how they have always been potent means of reconceiving a liberative Christianity. I talk about anti-imperial hermeneutics and decolonization. We hear Bob Marley's music and the sweet song of the calypso, the sound of the steel pan and the rush of Junkanoo. I have to put Junkanoo in, I'm Bahamian. But these are embodied forms of resistance that uniquely contest empire. So we listen to Bob Marley for my Jamaican co-panelists. We sing one love, one heart. We do that. But Bob is also the one who talks about the Babylon system is the vampire. You know, there's no one way to look at the complex strategies we've employed to contest a kind of toxic Christianity that has been violent and destructive, and unlike the way of Jesus. And another exciting part of the book is I highlight Caribbean women theologians, as many as I could find, because the truth is, they have been talking about these issues such as gender and sexuality in the region, challenging us to pay attention to the body. They've been teaching us that there is something deeply toxic and destructive in many, if not most, Western theologies around the concept or the idea of the body. The kind that entered the Caribbean, this kind of Christianity that entered the Caribbean, saw no problem with brutalizing, assaulting, and raping the Black body. There was a problem with bodies generally, and which has informed theologies around sin, salvation, redemption, and ultimately what it means to be human. I invite you to read that chapter. And one of the final things I do is talk about ecology. Along with people of the global South, we have implicit theologies and increasingly explicit ones that connect land, sea, and people. There has been a more connected theology at the heart of which is a lament. We hear it in our music, in the way we dance, in the way we do church. There is a deep thing going on. And we say we know God, but let me tell you, you want to know God? You know God when you have to deal with hurricanes and when you live on the edge. It influences and shapes the way you engage theologically. And I try to bring that out as best I can. And finally, I just want to advance that the region has produced deep and strong intellectual traditions that we can learn so much from, like Marcus Garvey, Walter Rodney, Franz Fanon, Eric Williams, CLR James, Derek Walcott, V.S. Naipaul, Sylvia Winter, Carolyn Cooper, George Lamming, Stuart Hall, Hilary Beckles, Vereen Shepherd. We have a wealth of intellectuals that we can theologize with and learn from. And you won't just be engaging in theology, you will also be engaging with a history of thought in the region. So that's my pitch. Enjoy the book, buy the book, read the book, and it comes from a region that we could do well to know better. Thank you.
Carlton, thank you so much. What an amazing sounding book. I'm sure everybody who's watching this will be, I don't want to mention any particular names of online platforms on which you might buy it, but going straight to the SCM Press website and ordering it. So much to explore there, and all the connections you're making with history, with interdisciplinary intellectual thought, with the history of the earth and the climate, with the heritage, the African traditional heritage, and just a lot to explore. And I'm really looking forward to what Eevee and Stephen are going to introduce us to continue the conversation and bring their own perspective. So you talked about highlighting Caribbean women's and womanist theologies. So I'm going to go next to Eevee and invite Eevee to speak with us. Thank you, Eevee.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm showing off. But the book, good, bad. So you need to get it because it's readable. you can have all of these brilliant ideas and you can wrestle with them and fight with them, and it is amazing. I want, no, Anglican is a thing. And in the region, there are two, well, when you talk, in the English-speaking part of the region, there are two major theological institutions, well, again, Holland, that the Anglicans go to. There are more. And one is the United Theological College of the West Indies, which is in Jamaica, which is ecumenical. And the other is Codrington College in the Bahamas, which is mostly Anglican, but other people go. And there are a lot of, as the region has developed, there are a lot of interesting tensions as well as things working together. We have a thing called the West Indies cricket team, who are beginning to learn again how to play cricket. But every now and again, there are dramas and interregional tensions that plague the cricket team. But theology, yeah, we work together, we fight together, we go together. I want to draw attention particularly to two of the chapters. And one of them is the, what I rephrase, Columbus's Ghost, rephrased by me as a Jamaican as Columbus Duppy. I think in the Bahamas, it's more a Jumbie. But we are haunted by the legacy of the past. And one of the ghosts that remains in the region and in the world as far as theological education is concerned is the matter of the legacy of Codrington. And it's worth, for those who don't know, a guy called Christopher Codrington, and Carlton goes into it in great detail, decided that the region needed a theological college for itself, and you have to, you know, give money to endow the college. So he left the college, he left the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, now USPG, of which Carlton is a trustee, had to burst you. And he left them and said, all right, here is the material wealth to put together this college. 2 estates, 300 slaves. And SPG said, thank you very much. And they kept those slaves until 1834, when they got compensation for it. But out of this particular mess of blood and shame and people being branded came some of the legacy of theological exploration. And I particularly was interested in the Reverend Mr. Pinder, the first principal, who was a white Barbadian slave owner who thought slavery was the greatest thing, presumably. But Mr. Pinder, I didn't know this bit of it, Carlton, on earth. Mr. Man left Barbados for Wales in 1835. That's Wales here, and set up Theological College here in the United Kingdom. Well, it wasn't, I don't know if it was the United Kingdom, yeah, anyway, in England, yeah. And set the precedent for much theological education going forward. So when we talk about the colonial hand on theological education, because his legacy led to things like Cuddesdon and da-da-da-da-da. The colonial hand that comes back to put their stamp on us in the Caribbean was the stamp of the white Barbadian slave owner was put on them. So it's duppy topper duppy, plenty haunting, and these things to be unpicked. The other bit I wanted to focus on was what he call it now, Nannish Sass. gender, sexuality, and the body. Of course, I was fascinated. And, you know, was chatting through with the Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, who gets mentioned in the book, saying, hey, imagine, I'm going to this thing with Carlton and so on. And here are, you know, and we're batting again some of the thoughts. And there's something called the CWTT, Caribbean Women Theologians for Transformation. And we meet online and quarrel about things. Quarrel is a good thing in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. But one of the riffs from this, okay, and there's a lot of good stuff, sexuality, the body, what is condemned, what is seen as sinful. But one of the things I was thinking about too, Carlton and others, is that I haven't seen a lot of, and maybe it's there, but not in the book, with what can be built on from the book, yeah, is leading from that, a theology of the family and how we have dealt with the family. Because the received theology is that we live in broken families. Because most of us are in family, you know, marriage is not a big deal. And the theory is that Christianity is into nuclear family and marriage. Now, where we get that, no, as an Anglican, I'm sure I'm going to get into trouble. But, you know, we have a supreme governor of the Church of England. I say nothing more about the sacredness of marriage and all that kind of story. Okay? So putting it on us that we Black slave people don't know how to contain ourselves, and we go ahead and we have broken families. And there's a fabulous book that was written in the early part of the last century called My Mother Who Fathered Me by Edith Clarke, a Jamaican sociologist, and she was quoting from a novel, yeah, this notion of my mother who fathered me. But the critique going back is that who says your mother fathered you? Your mother performed the roles that a mother performs. She is not your father. And who says your father has to be there to bring you up? A lot of cultures have systems where it is perfectly reasonable that the entire community are there to look after the child. So the biological father does not have to be the one who performs the role of fathering, whatever that may be. So it's things to, are our families broken or are they different? Lots of things to think about. And there's a Baptist, I don't know if he's still alive or dead, Vivian Panton, who did a lot of thinking about what he called common law marriage. But lots of things, and we have a way in Jamaica that if you slip sexually, they read you out of church and you're cast, well, the women anyway, the men tend to remain, but you know, but because the women will show the pregnancy and you're thrown out. Is that some, you know, all of these things to rethink. So me, I'm excited. I continue to go on reading the book and fighting with it. That's what I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, Eevee. That's some more issues to explore later. Fascinating. And I love that, the whole image of the haunting and the sort of the thought that our own theological education systems here were influenced by the slave experience, and then it was kind of it's a two-way kind of process or a cyclical process, and definitely interested in that that chapter that you're mentioning. Fantastic, thank you so much. So thirdly, to Stephen, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us, and interested to hear what you're making of the book.
Thank you, Alison. Good night to you, I believe it is. And we are grateful to SCM and to Modern Church and to Carlton for the opportunity to share in this really what we would call in old-time Jamaica auspicious occasion. But we mean that sincerely. Because to write any meaningful book takes time and effort and has to have a lot of heart and love as well as competence. And Carlton has displayed all of that and more in this book. And we were grateful for his contribution. Also, Carlton, I want to thank you for the outstanding tribute that it is to Caribbean reality and Caribbean theology as part of that. Rightly, as you have said, there is a lot of not just formal intellectual thought, but a lot of Caribbean resilience over the years in many ways that has not been known and documented. And from the outside, sometimes it is also misread as play and not recognizing that play is resistance for Caribbean people. So we thank you very much for doing that, for unearthing it a bit and unveiling it a bit more. And we really appreciate it. So the first 3 chapters, as you rightly said, display the breadth of complexity of Caribbean reality, but the ways in which the Caribbean theological enterprise has tried to navigate and negotiate that in the formal church space, but beyond that. So those 3 chapters alone will be worth the book. But then Carlton has done us a further favor by reflecting not just a history, but making contribution to particular issues. Eevee has mentioned some, we could mention all. In fact, all of the chapters are really worth themselves to be developed as courses, as texts, as podcasts, as all kinds of other things. And I hope we will do that in due course. So since Eevee has taken some, I'll just take a couple. Well, a little more than a couple, maybe about 3 or 4. One would be the chapter on revitalization and rejection that deals with the matter of the persistence of African traditional religions. Now, to be fair, the region is made up of different ethnic and cultural groups. So why choose African? It's because the majority of the population of the Caribbean, territorially and diasporically, are descended culturally from ethnically from people from Africa, West Central Africa, particularly, and Carlton lists some of the groupings in his book. But culturally, the Caribbean has been influenced a lot by African cultures, diasporic African cultures, as has been many parts of the so-called New World, like Brazil and North America and the like. So he has to mention that. And he gives a simple binary. Have we rejected the African cultures in the church and in theology? Have we accepted it? And are they being revitalized? I think it depends on where you look. I think it never was lost. When people speak about African retentions, it was suppressed, but it always was there. It was only a question as to how it would emerge and when it would emerge. And what Carlton is driving at is that it has emerged in particular spaces, in so-called mainline churches and liturgies and the like. But I would say in the wider space, Carlton, Eevee, Alison, Joe, everybody, it has never been lost. And in fact, Caribbean young people are now even more proud of their Africanness. We owe that to cultural icons like people like Louise Bennett in Jamaica, who made it cool to speak your own language, and Bob Marley himself. His biopic has just come out. You'll see it in London on the 31st of January. It was released in Jamaica 2 days ago. And it's not, there's no subtitle. He speaks only in his Jamaican language. And that is saying something. There's a confidence that we have culturally. More people are locking their hair, more people are affirming their Africanness. I think, therefore, the church has to wrestle with that. What does that mean when a kid wants to come to school with locks and is told that they can't because it's against the school rules and the school is run by a church? Those are the kinds of questions we have to begin to answer. Are we really liberated, or are we still rejecting what is there, and so on? So the book would open up that kind of question to I think, not just academic theologians, but pastoral leaders and church administrators and just the general public. So that's one, and I think that's very useful to put it front and center. And we thank you, Carlton. The other chapter that I want to pick up on quickly is chapter 6. It speaks about chanting down Babylon and anti-imperial hermeneutic. Now we could go to town on this because this resonates a lot with us, as you know, Carlton. Again, there's been a long history of that. While the scriptures have been used from time immemorial, and certainly in the Caribbean space, to serve the powers of empire and colonialism and enslavement and racism and genderism and classism and colorism, it was also utilized to counter all of these things, always. So whether we're talking about the Haitian Revolution or the 1831 uprising in Jamaica or the 1823 uprising in Demerara, people are chanting scriptures, quoting scriptures. So Bob Marley, who's referenced in the book, again, in that anti-colonial and anti-imperial hermeneutic, is really one, is standing in the line of that tradition. And in fact, it's a very interesting thing. I'm not sure if you know Carlton, but there's at least been one book that has been written about Bob Marley and the Bible that looks at his use of scriptural texts, particularly the Psalms and the wisdom literature. And it's a very useful book. I had a little hand in it. So I'm not recommending because of that, but because I know the value of the book. And you know, Marston or others were citing texts, and when people continue to preach and teach and so on, that continues. So in a way, what you have done again is excavated what is there and said, here is what needs to happen. And as empire, you know, is genuinely global now and has taken new forms, the question is, how can we utilize the Bible in this anti-imperial tradition? And you have raised some trajectories that I think we need to follow. My last two questions, chapters, I just make them brief in 2 minutes. One, the matter of rolling, Jordan rolling. I mean, Eevee would know this. UTC, we used to sing "Roll Jordan Roll," right, Eevee? it's one of the ways we used to tell when people needed to have their theology purified and elevated, right? We would sing "Roll Jordan Roll," and so it's interesting that you should more or less highlight that. Picking up on where people like Cartwright Davis, who you mentioned, talked about when he talked about that we're not just a landscape in the Caribbean, but we're a seascape. Yeah, and how the sea really defines us, but in the context of a climate crisis that is caused by the very colonialism and the continuance of that legacy in modern day empires, where the 1.5 centigrade temperature rise has been violated consistently, and sea rise is not just a future reality, but a current reality in the Caribbean, not to mention hurricanes. We have to tackle this. I think it is not just one of the issues we have to deal with. It is the central issue, because where there is no land, sea, or air, there's no life. And I think, if anything, we need to pick this up and pick this up fast and have dialogue. In the wider movement of reparations, right now, small island states are looking at how can we repair the damage brought on by these things, and deal specifically with climate justice. And I think Caribbean theology needs to be part of it. The Caribbean church, territorially and diasporically, need to be part of this. and your work will contribute to this. I shouldn't know that I'll use this chapter, no one else, nothing else. And I use the whole book in my classes as we discuss climate justice. So thank you, Carlton, for the work you've done, and blessings to you. And we hope it will have a long shelf life and that it will be widely read. Over to you, Alison. Thank you too.
Thank you so much. Again, a whole range of issues to follow up there, Stephen. Thank you so much. Particularly struck by the landscape, seascape, and the suggestion that, you know, climate change, the climate crisis, as a direct effect of colonialism, and connecting that with reparations issues, which are often seen as being purely about reparation for slavery. So that those connections are really powerful. Thank you so much. I could see Carlton nodding and smiling at particular points in both your presentations. So I think I'll go back to Carlton. The idea now is to just spend some time for each of our, I'll call you panelists, each of our panelists to reflect on something that they've heard one of the others say, which has had particularly, which has hit them particularly strongly, and to come back and develop the point that they've heard. So Carlton, I'm sure there's zillions of things that you would like to come back on and develop, but over to you to pick a couple of them.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Yeah, thank you both. And I have 2 points from each of you that I think it would be good just to have a conversation about and further. I agree with the things you say. And you would have, I mean, along with myself, but you know this and been wrestling with these things for far longer. But Eevee, let me start with Eevee. You know this thing about the legacies of theological education that you picked up. Last year was an interesting year where I found myself in many English cathedrals talking about legacies of enslavement, and that's a contemporary. That's a conversation that is only becoming more and more important, as everywhere we look, we find the links between the Christianity that we have now and its deep roots in a colonial past. And we're trying to find wisdom as to how to deal with that. But in doing that kind of work, in that kind of engagement, it just by chance, I had the shock of my life that a plaque that I had been walking around at Carlton College for 3 years is the same man and the same plaque that you find at Wells Cathedral. And the John Pinder, who was deeply tied to USPG, came to England, studied, went back to Barbados, was of the plantocracy, became chaplain, and theological education, because Codrington far outdates many of the places in England, was fashioned by this particular person. And it was fashioned out of a sense that it was not for the well-being of the slaves or Black people. And there's a deeply entrenched, often hidden belief that theology and God talk has to look and has to sound and has to mean that which the European, and in our case, the British of the 17th and 18th century believed, and a history far longer. But what always strikes me is the connectedness between violence and theological education. If it started on a plantation and made no distinction between the well-being of a human being, the life of a human being, and the gospel, that the gospel means that all should be free. And if that's the roots of the theological education, I think it's worth looking at. And of course, we have been on this track of trying to decolonize theological education, education in general, but theological education. And we have a long way to go. And I think it's something to think about. Certainly at Queen's, where we teach, we try to get people to be critical about the kinds of theologies they do. And a contextual theology itself is about asking the basic question, who am I and where do I stand in my theologizing? And the thing is, if I haven't answered that question for myself, I will only be passing on something that came to me, and what came to me is inherently violent, dismissive, xenophobic, racist, in every possible way. It does not see the human being as sacred. And I think that's something we need to seriously look at. And then there's the other thing, Eevee, you said about the family. And I looked into the book quickly. You know, when you write a book, you forget half of what you wrote. But there is this thing. What's his name? Oh my gosh, betwixt and between. Barry Shevans.
Barry Shevans.
Yes. So, you know, he features a lot, like yourself, Stephen. He features because one of the things he tells us about when thinking about family life in the region, the question isn't that it's broken or however we want to look at it, but actually, why is it that it's a miracle that there's a sense of familyhood in the first place? And the fact is, plantation society was not meant for people. We have these assumptions that you are born, you're born into a family, you get married, you have a bunch of children, you have a job, you retire. Whose version of life is that? The Caribbean was never meant to be that. You were meant to produce. You were a production house for Europe. Who cares about your intimate, personal, familial life? But somehow, we consistently move from, I think he calls it, from a disorder to a new order, a new kind of arrangement in life, in light of all the trauma of the society. And it's still in the back of my mind. Why are we something rather than nothing? And I think that's a testament to some creative, deeply spirit-filled, cunning, resistant, stubborn, surviving people who made me me. But anyway, that's a big question, Eevee. And I think deeper questions about there's a serious question to be asked about the versions of Christianity that came into the region. For example, the narrative of the matriarchal family needs to be interrogated, because that's part and parcel of a Christianity that had some serious ideas about civilization, civility, what it meant to be human, what it meant to be right, what it meant to be decent, what it meant to be holy. And a lot of that strikes me and has played out historically as quite toxic. And we need to wrestle with that. Stephen, you talked about African retentions, African, whatever we call it. Now, this is something, oh my gosh, I have every day to talk about Bob Marley or Jungle No or stick fighting, and a lot of these things, even for students in the Caribbean, they don't know. It's like I did not know about half of these things. The spiritual Baptist, I'm in Carlton College in Barbados, and I don't even know what the other island has. And what I'm doing is trying to bring all these things and their power. Sociologists and anthropologists have done research in the region and have gleaned so much from the region intellectually that have shaped how we think about life and how we philosophically approach human societies, human cultures, human relationships. The Caribbean has been used as a foundation for all of that. And I think the people who could do so much more is us, the theologians. Theologically speaking, there's so much to learn. There's so much to learn from Anansi, the trickster spider. There's so much to learn. I part of the work is this kind of ambivalent, creative, resistant, the kind of jester, trickster motif within Caribbean life. If you are a slave on a plantation and you have no power, what do? You become a trickster. You become like some people in the Bible. You become a prophet, you become an ambivalent character. You become like a Joseph. And we have time and time again this idea of how do you negotiate power. And the other thing is, Stephen, when you talked about, I end the book talking about ecology, and the environment and lament and all sorts of things. And I am, I name myself as someone from the English-speaking Caribbean, like the two of you. But when we look at the broader African Caribbean experience, oh my God, when you think of, say, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, and the Haitian independence and that contest between Napoleon and oh gosh, Toussaint Louverture. That's a huge lesson in international economic relationships, political relationships, and what a small country can do, but also the cost of that. And it's a big lesson of how not just the people, we can't just think about individuals, cultures, but collectively, we have been used and abused in every possible way and still continue to thrive or try or survive. And I think we need to be proud of this. I don't know people's politics, but Mia Mottley, the Barbadian Prime Minister at COP26, and her moving speech, she's a Caribbean woman. She's a Caribbean leader who knows what it means in every experience of life, politically, culturally, theologically, sociologically, in every way. We are on a knife edge. And we're doing our best. We're doing our best. And others can learn. Sorry, I started preaching, sorry.
It's absolutely fine, Carlton. Thank you so much. I did kind of write the word passion into the outline for this evening, and we're certainly getting a lot of that, which is fantastic and completely appropriate, obviously. So, Eevee, what have you heard this evening that you responded to particularly powerfully?
Yeah. And of course, I'm kind of departing from my brief, but never mind, it's relevant. I've been thinking about, as we have been talking, the future and our young people. And I want to put forward two little snippets that I overheard. One was quite long ago, and one is very recent. The Caribbean Women, CWTT, whatever, have been very exercised about the second one. So the first one was, I'm teaching a class, I'm in Jamaica, and we're sharing about something that you're proud about. And this lass gets up and she says with great passion, oh, she's so happy that we had slavery because that is how we learned about Jesus. And I managed to preserve her from being massacred by the rest of the people who were there, and to keep myself back from doing her damage, because the damage that had been done to her mind was considerable. So that's one. The second one that CWTT were very distressed about last week, I think, there was a service for one of our denominations. And a lass got up, a young lass, and she departed from the set prayers that she had been given and went forward to pray earnestly that the buggery laws would not be repealed, that Jesus would keep the buggery laws still in place, and the laws against obia and other African retentions. And the question is, here is this young woman in the 21st century in one of our churches who felt emboldened to say them things. How we go forward? Brethren and sistren, what will we do? What are we to do now?
I suppose, sorry, Alison.
No. Go ahead. That's
So one of the things, again, I want to go back to the book, but to pick up something Eevee just said. One of the things that we have to be aware of, and Carlton, I know you mentioned it in the book, is that we have not only to think about churches that came from Europe as part of the colonization process of the Caribbean, but we also have to think about churches that came from North America that also came with their own agendas. They were initially part of them, some of them part of the enslavement, the North Atlantic enslavement exercise. Not that's North Atlantic, but the Atlantic slave trade, or enslavement of people. And even after slavery was abolished on one side of the Atlantic, it was not on the other side. And then their legacies continued into the 20th and dare say in the 21st century. They reflect particular theologies that many people who are Christians have learned. So if we're going to do a serious reflection of contextual theology in the Caribbean, we also have to factor that in. And why that is important is precisely because of what Eevee just said. Because some of those theologies have looked at particular things in particular ways and have transmitted that to their members. And they're sincere people who love God, who love the church, who are progressive in other areas, who decolonize, but in these particular matters feel strongly there, and it's their faith. And some of them are young people. It's their faith. So that we need to, Carlton speaks about a dialogue. I think there's a need for serious dialogue. I don't think we can repeat the mistakes of the past where one set of theologies were able to impose on others that which they should believe or not. And even if we have a different view, we need to present those views respectfully, and have rigorous dialogue and come to, if not consensus, agreement, whether it is agree to disagree or agree on particular matters. But it's not just going to go away because it is deeply entrenched and held by people. I mean, it happens in the UK as well, around these very issues. You know, they might have other names for it, but it happens. So I think we have to recognize that we are dealing with a plurality, a plethora. You can't just talk about Caribbean theology, you have to talk about, as I argued, how many years ago, Carlton, 30 odd years ago, that we have to talk about theologies in the Caribbean, theologies of the Caribbean, and not just Caribbean theology, because we have a plethora. And that's true both at the academic level as well as the congregational and denominational levels, as well as ecumenism, because we focus on one side of the church sometimes, the other sides of the church. I can say, as a practitioner, the church has come together in the middle quite more in the last 30, 35 years across the whole Caribbean. But there are still things that not only are different, but can divide and polarize. And so it's important to dialogue carefully and respectfully, even when we disagree. But good points, Eevee, because that comes up regularly, and those issues in particular come up regularly.
Thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions from people who are watching in, and I'm going to put, because this is also on the theme of the fluidity and dialogue of ideas back and forth. Elaine Graham, who's chair of Modern Church, going back to Carlton, what you were saying about the rich intellectual tradition and heritage of the Caribbean. And she was thinking of Paul Gilroy's idea of Black Atlantic, and asking what you and the other panelists feel has been the global influence of Caribbean culture and theology in Europe and America, and maybe also back to Africa, because that's very much about this fluidity of ideas. Do you have thoughts on that, Carlton, or the other two?
Well, I have thoughts, but I open up the space for my my co-panelists.
It's your day, Carlton.
Yeah.
So you should open that.
I think if I understand the question, there's a lot in that question, obviously. But I think one of the interesting things, and this is how I see it, is that you have key intellectuals who have not their Caribbean roots and how their lives have been shaped by the experience of the region haven't been acknowledged as much as it needs to be. So, for example, if I were to say the word Frantz Fanon, Martinique and French Caribbean intellectual, and a key persons who would have critiqued and engaged with Freud and Adler and Jung in terms of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thought and theory, but who's also a revolutionary intellectual who is engaging with Marxism and the idea and deconstructing and critiquing colonialism and empire and capitalist thought. Not many people know Fanon or Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is a key text across the African continent. And maybe he is a name that a lot of Caribbean people know, but not many, but certainly a name that might be more popular in the intellectual circles. But when it comes to thinking about economics, politics, this is not a small figure. This Guyanese historian is not a small intellectual. And many of them, their ideas, the way they have reflected have been shaped by the region and have influenced ideas across the globe. But little attention, they haven't really gotten their due. Not really. Sylvia Wynter hasn't gotten her due. And the list goes on and on and on. Currently, and I guess in due course, we're going to be talking about Hilary Beckles and Vereen Shepherd and Carolyn Cooper and these kinds of people. They are present with us, and they operate on an international scene, engaging in things like reparations, the Caribbean Reparations Commission. But these are not. They are operating in ways that the world needs to hear. But I don't think the world is ready to listen. And it's one of these tragedies in the academia. I hope that answers to some degree. I invite my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Eevee.
Yeah, again, we bubble. And, thinking in terms of the political realities, who can forget Uncle Fidel? And Michael Manley and the non-aligned movement. And of course, the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the two Amy Garveys. man make sure I'm married 2 women named Amy, so him don't make a mistake. Those movements and those, there is at the political level and the political ideas and ideologies that have shaped the globe and that have been pushed back and forth. And we're still there, and we need not step back. We've had, I forget that, like 4 Caribbean Nobel laureates. The first one was in economics, and 2 in literature, and one as part of the group in climate justice and science. So we're not, and it's a little region, we're not small, and we need to remember who we are. And never forget, in terms of theology, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Dr. Philip Potter, a big man from the little island of Dominica, who reshaped the thinking of the World Council of Churches. We lick a bit, but we tolerate. In Jamaica, we'd say we're small, but we are mighty.
Amen.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to add to this?
Well, we could spend a long time adding. I just wanted to go back to Gilroy. Gilroy himself had Caribbean roots and went through various phases of his life, He started out by, his major work was the Black in the Union Jack, trying to say Black people were not being affirmed in Britain. And then the Black Atlantic, for which he became known. Then he went through a period where he wanted to transcend race against race, and then end up in melancholic blues. So Gilroy himself has gone through phases, as we all do, as you evolve as a self and as the context changes, you too change. So one of the things we have to learn from this is that Caribbean theological thought, just like Caribbean wider thought, and just like thought generally wherever, always changes. And we can't just read a book that was written in 1980 and assume the author is frozen in time, like watching reruns of your favorite movies and thinking the person looks the same. And then when you see your icon and your star, they just look different. People change. So we have to always, look at the context. The other thing is that I think we have a tendency to locate thought and action in silos. So some people study political science, some people study economics, some people know about cultural forms, some people know about theology and so on. And while we are specialists, and of course, each of us as individuals, whether we are academics or not, can only focus on a few things. We have to remember life is one thing. Life is basic, it's interconnected. And so I think Carlton tries to do this and does it successfully in my mind in this book. He opens us up to say, hey, let's think about some other people. Let's get out of the theological silo. Let's talk about Fanon. Let's talk about Hilary Beckles. These people are different people, varying shepherds. They're not theologians in a formal sense, but they are people who, as Caribbean people, have contributed and who we need to learn from. And Eevee said the same thing just now when she spoke about Fidel and Michael Manley and so on. I think we have to draw on this. One of the things that the Western missionary theology tried to do was to tell us that theology must only be about God in a neutral, abstract, contextless world. So God is in heaven, and we just need to study God in the heavens like we're studying stars that are always fixed there, we think. Contextual theology, and our theology is contextual, by the way. Whether we deal with Greco-Roman theology of the 3rd century or we're dealing with 21st century Caribbean theology, all theology is contextual. Contextual theology said, take where you are seriously, geographically, culturally, theological, all the others, and then reflect on where God is in all of that, and then speak about that. And I think, again, we need to continue to do that, but be open to learn from others. And even to be critical, but to learn. And it's important. And of course, from people to learn from us. We have some things to say that are very important. And Carlton, again, has highlighted many of the people who have been saying. And he's going to join that canon very soon. Once the book comes out next week, he's going to join that. We have so much things to say right now, Eevee. So much things to say, many things. And we need to keep saying it.
Fantastic. In fact, when Carlton, you were talking about the stubborn resistance and the survivor, what comes out, the theology that comes out of that survival, and trauma. And I was thinking of other trauma theologies and other contextual theologians, and how we talk to one another about it's both the specificity that you're talking about, and there are specifics around trauma theologies that come out of whether you're an abuse survivor, and obviously the whole intersectionality issue that you survive trauma differently depending on your, the sum of the specificities that apply to you and the sense in which you're part of a community. So yeah, it feels like this book almost kind of is another way of saying, well, here's another conversation partner that we can kind of focus around, whether we're coming from an LGBTQ plus positionality or feminist or womanist, and again now that the ecocide perspective of the rest of the planet and other creatures that are not human, and the need for a liberation theology from that perspective. So I really love that sense that this is about another contribution to this amazing plethora of contextual theologies that give us together and between them a bigger sense of who God is. And I just wondered if there are any stories or examples, Carlton, that you have about any of those kind of alliances that are forming. I mean, that must happen in your work. And I know that the teaching that you've done on the course that I lead for Sarum, that you speak on many things, but the liberation contextual perspective is what's common to those many things. But are there any sort of initiatives, things you're involved in where you think, yeah, this is a kind of a node of something fertile, which is where different groups are coming together to explore?
I want to go back to what you mentioned, the trauma theologians, and this whole idea of trauma, which is a word that we throw around that is commonplace, but then you really need to be careful with where the word becomes too commonplace, like resilient. A lot of people don't even like this word anymore. But trauma theologians are, and I really am learning. I learn so much, and I'm really interested in theologies that deal with the human experience of trauma. And I don't see a better example really than the African Caribbean, which has reshaped my theological thinking. I have journeyed far with this idea, and currently I think a lot about another word that's a bit problematic, healing. But I'm now shifting to think about wholeness making. Because healing can be a problematic word, and trauma theologians would tell you healing, you need to be careful with it, because trauma is like a disruption in your sense of your narrative of oneself. You don't go back to what you were before. You have to transcend and create a new reality, a new story. And I think the Caribbean has done that and is trying to do that. But where that lands for me is, I really, with everything in my being, I really believe that the theological agenda has been so much about what is right. And I make this point in the book. My doctrine is righter than your doctrine. I have the right doctrine. I think that is an enlightenment, a post-enlightenment rationalistic idea that compares one knowledge system to another. But I think out of the Caribbean experience, we need a deeper question. The question is not whether I should be right or wrong. That's important, a sense of right and a deep sense of truth. But what about being whole? I think for the enslaved African ancestors, they they didn't care. They could recite the Lord's Prayer and say it right, or say the liturgy right. I don't want to get beaten no more. I don't want to get hanged. I don't want to be in a system or a situation that does not care for my humanity. That's a deeper question. And I think we need to theologically invest in that agenda. And I think that's something that the world, the church generally, what happens if we think more about wholeness and less about rightness? And what happens when we read scripture this way? I think it's worth it. And I want to learn about from the trauma theologian. Please keep writing, keep investing. Karen O'Donnell, please keep doing your thing. Katie Cross, keep doing your thing. Amen.
And I wanted to bring Eevee in here because it raises for me the question of how the methodology for engaging with theological truth and what theological truth is, because you're I mean, we've talked about embodied, the whole nature of embodied theology, and I want to bring Eevee in because I think it's your article and your presentation to the Modern Church Conference was about storytelling through a poetic narrative, and I feel that's a really, this sense that if we're going to break down this Enlightenment idea about rightness and move towards wholeness, we need to move towards a theological methodology that is more in line with that, which is not just about what intellectual engagement. So Eevee, have you got anything to say about that? And then I have got a question which relates to it from somebody who's watching.
Yeah, just in light of some of the book, Carlton brings in the issue of spirit. And I want to say that how I've been engaging more recently with theology is spirit. Mind is nice and mind comes into it, so you have to do the research. But spirit, what are these people telling you? People from our history, people from the biblical stories. What, suppose it, not the way we've received it, but what else can they say? And I've engaged with them in that kind of way. So, and I think this is it's a way of engaging that was certainly done in the early centuries. And it's a good way. It's not the only way, but it's a good way that fights against the sort of masculinist, rational thing. Go with the spirit. We need the spirit to combat the doppies.
Thank you. And there was a question from, now, apologies that I may get the pronunciation of this person's name. It looks like Amika Liebird. And the question to Carlton, but it could equally to be anyone else, is, I think it's a really important question. How do you envision the book being used as a resource for Caribbean people, especially outside of academia?
I think I tried to write in as less a discursive, highly academic style as possible. I tried to make it accessible. I think I've achieved that. So I think for people outside of academia, this is an okay read. It's not too heavy. Stephen said something about podcasts and all sorts of stuff that hasn't even gone into my mind yet. I'm not like these millennials. You clearly like a millennial. You think in this way. But one day we're going to have to work on that. But I'm sure there are ways to bring the ideas. I mean, the ideas are really are there. It can be repackaged in many different ways. But I tried. because I really don't care to just communicate to stuffy to the academy. I don't think we roll like that as a people. We knowledge is for everyone.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have thoughts on that? Because I think the key word there is a resource, isn't it? This book is a resource. So how do you see it panning out as a...
Well, I did say some of what Carlton just echoed. I'm glad he actually heard when I said podcasts and so on. That's deliberate. Apart from being a pastor of a church, of churches with young people and students and so on, who are, millennials and, Gen Z and Gen Alpha and so on. I've come to recognize a part of the Caribbean reality is that we are oral tradition people. So we read books by listening, for instance. Many youngsters, they're on the treadmill or they're in aerobics and they're listening whole books. So it's no longer just, people like yourself, myself, we want to feel the texture and have the hard copy. They don't need to have the hard copy. And they don't always want to hear the whole book either. They want to have the main ideas. The same with sermons. I preach every week virtually, and people don't necessarily always want to hear the whole service, but give us a TikTok of 2 minutes of it, and then it's interesting. We head into the deeper dive, as they would say. So I think we have to be creative, because the idea is to make sure that the ideas are heard and that all ideas content, but also, again, some of the young people, including some in my house, say to me, remember, you're a thought leader and you're an influencer. Yes, and we have that responsibility to try to lead thought and to influence. So again, lead not by imposing, but by serving, assisting people to think differently. They know more than we do, the young people. Majority of the Caribbean is under the age of 35 now. But we are wiser, hopefully, because we have lived and made some mistakes and learned from them. And I think it's important that we do so and use all the means that we can.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to put you each on the spot now, because we're coming to the end of our time, and we are, all of us, I think, on this call, and many of those listening or watching involved in theology and theological education or church life. So I'm going to ask you each, what's one key thing you think what's one key way in which you think this book can challenge our normative theology? And I'm going to let Carlton go last. I'm going to pounce on Eevee first.
That's a deep question. Okay.
In a minute.
In a minute, yeah. If we can wrestle with some of the ideas about gender in its widest sense, and rethink the ways that we have inherited our theologies of the body. Let the Caribbean influence your rethinking. That's what I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you. Stephen.
The book throws down several challenges. One of them is to say to the so-called normative theology that it too was contextual, and that the context that it came out of and came into had a great deal of violence to it. And the violence was not just to the physical bodies of people, but to minds and spirits. And if there was not an attempt at the spirit level to be resistant, and there was not a group survival through that spirit, we would not have been here. And so that there is a need, says the book, for normative theology to interrogate itself and to allow itself to be interrogated, to say, why is it normative in the first place? Who made it normative? Was it that because you had the power to rule, you had the power to name and to be normative? So that's important, but there needs to be openness to dialogue. We're not just trying to heap guilt, we're trying to say, look, let's look at this where there's need for repentance, where there's need for humility, where there's need to learn, because we're now all to be at a global table where we can share. So that would be my takeaway.
Brilliant, thank you. And last but not least, Carlton.
Yeah, I think in this country and modern churches is within the UK context. I think we have had challenges from Black theologians and womanist theologians in this country. So Beckford and Reddy and Valentina and Alexander and Dulcie Dixon. In this context, there have been those who have been looking and challenging us about the nature of church. I think the Caribbean is a place that consistently points out we have to pay attention to who we are as church. I think historically, there is so much we have not even begun to unpack. But the ghost of that history will not go away. So Caribbean people and Caribbean theology, contextual theology, dealing with the context reminds us that, hey, this stuff is not going to go away unless it is faced.
Wow. Carlton, congratulations on what is an amazing book. I hope that this evening will play some role, and Modern Church can play a continuing role in making sure it gets news of it is spread widely, and that it's read and given the attention that it deserves in transforming our theological education and our churches. So brilliant. And Eevee and Stephen, thank you hugely for your contribution this evening, and for everything that you've brought to making this conversation so nuanced and multi-layered and really exciting. So and to those who've been listening online, and to those who will be listening in the future by accessing this on our YouTube channel, thank you very much, and I hope you've got as much out of it as I know we all have. So thank you very much, and goodbye everyone.